chapter in the beautiful story of the friendship between our two nations, the United States of America and the Jewish and democratic state of Israel. Both of us who seek to do good and need to be strong, both of us.
All right, folks, welcome. I'm turn that a little bit to episode 34 of Left Afternoon with me, David Griscom. Hey, David.
How's it going, brother?
It's going well. SB8, Anti-Mask Tyranny, and Back to the Workshop in the UK, featuring Stella Rooney tonight. It's good to be here. We got a little bit of a Sleepy Joe.
Yeah, and we gotta say just up front that it doesn't seem like that's an actual that was probably a doctored video, but it's very, very fucking funny.
It is cool,
and it has been amazing to see just how much one for one the right is with the left, in the sense of when Trump was president, they were doing the same kind of thing. Oh, you need to get him out of office. You gotta get Trump out of office because he's mentally declining right now. And now the Republicans are doing the exact same thing.
Control. What is it? Control. Now that I Control C, Control V. That's
yeah.
I don't know why, but they're Control
Copy
C,
and paste
Control
politics.
V. just the resistance. So yeah, have Lauren Boebert and Glenn Beck strategizing well. Geez, if we impeach Joe Biden, that means Kamala is president, and which is basically just a conversation of if we impeach Donald Trump, then we got Pence to deal with.
I mean, that conversation about Pence versus Trump probably happened millions of times.
Yes.
Over the 4 years of the Trump presidency.
Yeah, and
they were all as boring as the last.
Sort of fantasy sports sort of discussions. Like, wouldn't it be cool if this player was on that team? Yeah, and I mean, just the scandals. There's also got Sleepy Joe checking his watch as the coffins roll in from Afghanistan, and it's just. The thing, the problem is we have a record of laughing at that during the Michael Brooks show, during the Trump, because Trump obviously was not behaving himself with a whole lot of comportment. And that was funny. It's not, a reason to impeach the motherfucker.
Well, it's not politics, right? Like, that was the thing that was so funny about it. It's like Matt and I were saying before the show, it's like we used to laugh at every one of those Trump moments. But the difference between like what we were doing and what Michael was doing was that we were just playing them because we thought they were genuinely funny. Not that we're like, this is going to be the one quick trick that gets rid of Trumpism. And it's like, nope, I'm sorry, y'all. It's not that easy. And, a little friendly advice to our friends on the other side. It's not going to be that easy. Either.
Yeah. I mean, Trump kind of ruined it, guys. Like you're not going to be able to get Biden on stuff like that after what Trump did.
That's so true. Well, speaking about getting away, we have to talk about one of the most egregious examples of right-wing overreach that we've seen in a long while now. And that's SB8 here in Texas. And I think that people who have been saying things like this in the past day are correct that, this is a moment where you are seeing Roe v. Wade evaporate in front of your own eyes. And we'll get to the Supreme Court and all the problems in a moment. I just want to say up top, this is a very real threat. This is not culture war BS. This is a very serious threat to people's lives, to people's dignity, and to women's rights all across, obviously, Texas, but the country as well. And we need to take this threat extremely seriously. For people who aren't familiar with the way that this law works and why it's so insidious, is that it's essentially a ban on abortions past 6 weeks. For people who aren't familiar with this kind of stuff, that is a period of time that is so short that the vast majority of people would miss any signs that they were pregnant. So they would already be outside of that window, making any kind of attempt to access healthcare illegal for them. But what is so sinister about this bill, and it truly shows how long this fight has been going on and how long this attempt from the right wing has been going on, how methodical this bill is. And we'll get to that kind of long arc of politics around abortion in a second. But The way that this bill is enforced is it encourages private citizens to sue women and abortion providers, and also entices them with a financial reward for doing so. Right. So instead of it being the state making these suits against people, it is individuals, private individuals who have nothing to do with that person, nothing to do with the organizations that are providing abortions, and everything to do with turning this state and turning our society and our community into a constant, protracted social war. And that's something that the Republicans have become very skilled at, as we'll get to in a little bit with the masks and Matt. But, like they have found a way to turn society, community into a space where you suspect your neighbors, right? You're prepared for conflict constantly. And in this case, I mean, it's extreme and egregious.
I can't get over that. The community surveillance, sort of deputizing everybody as bounty hunters for anyone who might not only get an abortion, but aid and abet, like a cab driver or a friend, like helping somebody go, absolutely like dystopian.
It's chilling. And just in the aftermath, I won't name names because everybody's reacting and trying to find the best way to make sure that they're safe and that they're able to provide for people in the future. But it has been sort of chilling to see some of these organizations that advocate for women's rights having, notes on the front page of their website saying, we actually can't perform any services for the next 2 weeks while we recalculate what our strategy is. Right. This is, it's a very chilling thing. And one I will say is that it's shocking to folks because everyone saw this law for what it was, which was a completely unconstitutional and illegal law, right? And people had a hope that the Supreme Court would intervene, and they didn't. They didn't even hear the case. It's not even that the Supreme Court ruled one way or another. They refused to hear a case on this. Now, it should be said, it could potentially happen in the future. It has been thrown out or anything like that. But by refusing to hear this, they have now allowed this to become the law in the state of Texas. I can only try as much as possible to convey the seriousness and the weight of this moment. What we can do here is sort of try to understand why we're in this present situation. We'll get to that in just one moment, but I do want to throw in some positive ideas, right? Or at least hope. There are a lot of incredible organizations here in Texas. Lilith Fund is one. We'll put a link to places that people can donate and look to help out to in the show notes in a little bit. But I want to remind people what fills me with pride and hope, and to be honest, a bit of fear, is the realization and the truth of talking to people who have been fighting so hard in this state and all across the country to make sure that these rights don't get eroded. That people are going to challenge this, and people are going to fight this, and people are going to put themselves and their communities and their organizations and their families at risk to make sure that people's basic fundamental human rights are not infringed upon. And you can never be guaranteed of victory, but I do know with the tenacity and the power of these people who have been fighting here in Texas that there will be a victory, and we just have to do as much as we can to try to help and support folks. So remember that it's okay to take a second and be like, okay, this is overwhelming and a very dangerous moment, but also remember that there are extremely fucking brave people out there who are willing to put a lot on the line. Yeah.
Do you want to get to some of the recrimination now?
How do you mean? Yeah, for sure. Yeah. How do we get here? Sorry. I was at a huge rally, a month or so ago here. And it was really powerful to realize that, there are people who are fearless. So yeah, let me just give a second to because we should be fucking mad. And in moments like this, it's you have to realize what's at stake. And this is why I've been so sick of listening to a certain kind of Democrat over the years, droll on about how every election, this is the most important election of your lifetime. Right. And then whenever anybody comes into power, a kind of refusal to do anything concrete about it. I've seen people, rightfully take to task Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer for, almost immediately put out a statement. We're going to fight as hard as possible. And yeah, where were they, a week ago when people were warning that this was a problem, for sure. But let's start with the first and foremost problem here, and that's the Supreme Court. And I can't litigate our entire, argument against that organization. We've done a lot of videos on it, but I'll tell you this right here and now. This was always in the cards. This was always in the cards. The Supreme Court's history, as much as the people who love and defend it like to say that it defends the minority from the tyranny of the majority, it does not do that. Look at its damn history and you'll learn.
The minority only ever means wealthy and property
The
holders.
minority only means wealthy, and patriarchal powers. I mean, just give me a break on this shit. And people are saying, well, what are you talking about, David? What about Roe v. Wade, right? What about the thing that is challenged? What was the historical context of Roe v. Wade? Mass movements demanding that this right, that women's right to have to health care, would not be infringed by a bunch of patriarchal Christian assholes, right? All across this country, abortion was becoming legalized because of this mass mobilization, these grassroots organizations, these people fighting in the streets to make sure that these rights were not infringed. Roe v. Wade comes in and it basically put everything on pause and made abortions legal in the country, not from any kind of radical sense. It's saying like, well, women fundamentally as human beings have the right to control their own bodies and right to healthcare. It came to it from an extremely conservative avenue, right? Saying because of the right to privacy, blah, blah, right? The point here is that Roe v. Wade comes in and it's a victory when it happens. Don't get me wrong. But it puts this thing over our head forever, that if ever the Supreme Court's makeup changed enough, that it could be struck down and overruled, right? It never settled the question. And it's always been used since then by both the Democrats and the Republicans to try to rile up and shore up support, probably in communities where they wouldn't be able to win it in the first place, right? It's always made this a very a ticking time bomb ready to go off, right? So when people would make those arguments about the Supreme Court, for example, in 2016 to folks, you would have to remind them that's like, well, this problem goes much deeper than just one election. We can't be living in a situation where we're, one of the two parties losing in a presidential election at any time could mean utter disaster for women's healthcare in this country.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and it's to specifically blame people for not being on the ball, particularly voters, I think is just insane, particularly when the actual leadership of the party is not having people like Ruth Bader Ginsburg step down and do the bare minimum of what they need to do to fix this problem. And that's really this is true in all sorts of contexts. Like there's nothing fruitful to blame the regular voter. It's so revealing of a type of politics, I think.
But it's also an absurd way to try to run a democracy too, right? Where like everything is always in threat in the sense too, where it's like, okay, all of these things are always like directly under threat, but we don't really have any kind of other democratic avenues where we can implement radical change, right? It was always a kind of defensive posture, which we talk about a lot, why a lot of people are pessimistic about politics, right? It's like things people are taught this from the beginning, that politics is only going to make things worse, right? And at best, maybe make sure that, basically stop it from getting any worse there. Look, I mean, National Democrats for sure should have made this a priority. They could have been, working and using their majorities that they have to start implementing protections for folks. I'll tell you one thing, that state and local governments across this country have been working overtime, even when they're out of power, to make sure that once, a Roe v. Wade decision is overturned, that, abortion will be made illegal in those states. Texas is one of those. I don't know if you have anything else on the national Dems, unless, because I wanted to say some things about Texas in particular.
Have at it.
In Texas, what's so frustrating about this moment is that since the GOP, since the Republicans came up with a very similar kind, at least in the sense of like it was bold and had like a lot of strategy behind it, a strategy to flip the state of Texas from being a Democratic Party stronghold to something that now people think it's possible for a Democrat to win statewide office, right? There has been no counter strategy since. It's almost been decades now of just constant bleeding. And I'm going to tell you the two main factors here are this bullshit hope that demographics are destiny, right? And primarily what that means for the Democratic Party is that they think that they have a captured voting bloc in the state of Texas, Black people and Hispanic people. And all that we have seen in the past few years, and specifically in 2016 and made much worse in 2020, is that people aren't going to show up for you if you don't provide for them. Jessica Cisneros, after the 2020 debacle here in the state of Texas, and if people aren't familiar with politics here, I understand. But just a quick primer, like there's a shitload of big talk here in 2020 that the Democrats were going to not only maybe win with Biden at the top of the ticket, but they were definitely going to flip the legislature, right? And in fact, they not only didn't flip the legislature, they lost seats, right? And they lost vote share in the Rio Grande Valley, in communities they never should have been losing votes in. And someone like Jessica Cisneros was coming and she tweeted this out after the fallout. Said, I was calling up the Democratic Party headquarters and saying, we got to do something in this part of the country. We have to start showing up for Tejanos and Hispanic Texans. And they were met with silence. Instead, double down on this strategy that you're going to be able to pry away suburban voters from the Republican Party. And while you might be able to do that, and we saw that was one of the fascinating things about the Biden strategy, there is a definite ceiling in the state of Texas for suburban voters that you're going to be able to pull away. And also, if you are supposed to be the party that's supposed to be standing up, we all know the Democratic Party is a complete disaster and isn't actually this, but that's how they brand themselves, as the party of, a multiracial working class coalition. And every moment when it comes down to doing politics, they abandon those people. There's no excuse for them to be losing votes in that part of the state. The suburban strategy is a failure, not just like electorally in the sense of like, oh, I'm a pundit or somebody trying to make the Democratic Party strong. It's a failure for the history of this country and the history of Texas in particular, because it opens up these doors for stronger and stronger GOP majorities to allow them to do this kind of damage. The fact is that do not let the Democratic Party and the Texas State Democratic Party, with the leaders that it has today, use this to raise a shitload of money and then to maintain the same strategy that they've been doing that got us into the situation in the first place. And that has been one of the most frustrating things that I've been seeing today. It's a bunch of people out there demanding that, like, oh, we just need to trust the people who got us into this nightmare more and give them more money and show up more. No, these people need to be kicked out of their positions. And if there's any kind of future for, for a different kind of politics here, there needs to be a different kind of political leadership in the state of Texas. And it needs to be much more representative of the working class base of this state, instead of this kind of suicidal tilt and bent to trying to become the party of wealthy suburbs. Not just in Texas, but across the damn country, but specifically in this moment, Texas, because this is what you get. You get a lot of people upset, a lot of people hurt, and nobody to lead us out of it other than maybe donating more money to the Democratic National Committee, right? Yeah. There's no quick solution. There's no donor-based answer to this problem. It's the high time for the corporate wing of the party to get out of the way. They don't know what's happening in the rest of Texas, and they refuse to listen to all of us who have been trying to warn them for a long ass time.
No, it's absolutely a national abdication when you look at the stories saying we're going to out-organize voter suppression in the future, right? Well, what that means, I mean, think about who's really hurt by voter suppression. And you need to look at these parties, particularly like the corporate wings of them, as collaborationist. And they don't mind a electorate that swings back and forth enough, as long as more poor people are cut out of it.
And I have to say this, there's no doubt that dealing with voter suppression in Texas is something that has to happen, right? That's just basic. That's just like, do you have morals or not have morals, right? But this kind of fantasy that some of the people in the Democratic Party have been trying to make about Texas, right, is that, oh, well, Texas isn't the slogan has always been like, Texas isn't a Republican state. It's like a low voting state, right? You had historic levels of voting in 2020, and they weren't able to get the kind of results that they wanted. And like, look, don't get me wrong, there's a lot of gerrymandering and all this kind of things.
Yeah.
But this kind of like, we're just going to sit on our hands and like, we're just going to be delivered victories attitude that a lot of people have had in Texas. And honestly, the demographics is destiny argument is like, that's all across the country, but they love it here. Because, there's no self-reflection needed, right? It's just going to happen someday. We're learning and we're seeing in real time that that's not going to work. And the results are disastrous for us.
Yeah. And it's interesting. There's a new book that came out actually by an academic that, like, even the academics are like, yeah, this whole thing we did about there's a literal book called I don't know it was, and it's didn't turn out to be so fixed.
Well, I mean, it's also rude and essentialist too.
Exactly, that's the problem.
Well, I'm sorry, like I hate to be glib about this, but there is just no cheat code to politics. And this kind of idea that some liberals have had that like things are just going to sort of materialize for them. Maybe it's just because we're socialists, for example, and we've learned that like, the working class of the world is not just going to like rise on their own. That like we sort of are, maybe a little bit inoculated against this kind of like fixation that you don't have to do strategy, you don't have to do organizing. It's got to stop, man. Because at the end of the day, it's like you have to understand that people are people and that there are ways for our opponents to make inroads with communities, even if you might think it's absurd, right? There are ways for Republicans to make inroads with the Hispanic and Tejano community in Texas. There are ways for them to make inroads with the Black community in Texas and all across the country, right? We have to be stopping that from happening. And the only way to stop that from happening is to be providing for people and showing them something different.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that brings us kind of to where the GOP is attempting to make inroads right now, which is on the sort of anti-mask issue. And I just want to play a couple clips. This first one is from a Pennsylvania Republican congressional candidate, Teddy Daniels. And here is him talking to Tucker Carlson on Fox Nation. So not the big time show, but the sort of online.
This is the one where he's in the cabin.
Yeah, this is the cabin one where he talks to like Charles Murray and stuff.
Okay, if America, Tucker. Okay, if you want to wear a mask, wear a mask.
Yeah.
If you don't want to wear a mask, don't wear a mask. That's what makes this country great with the vaccines. If you've had that conversation with your doctor and you feel a vaccine is the best route for you, go for it.
It's probably enough for that clip. So working backwards.
Just saying really quick, how many Americans do you think, okay, I don't want to take it from you.
No, say it.
I mean, how many Americans have an actual relationship with a doctor that they can call? I mean, I'm sorry, maybe it's just me, but
that is a massive hurdle in America. Like, I don't have a fucking doctor that I can just be like, hey, what about this vaccine? That is, you're creating a hurdle because they're just going to do that for free. Like, oh yes, thanks for calling me at home because we're that tight. Yeah, get the fucking vaccine, you moron. Like, hang up. And so like that thing, that is a glaring hurdle. But you notice a lot, which is like, yeah, that consult your doctor. Like, no, that is way too much effort to put towards this vaccine. Just go get the fucking vaccine. And the first part about just choose to whether or not you wear a mask or not. Well, I want to play this other clip. This is by Carrie Prejean Bowler. Now, she is former Miss California USA, although that was revoked, that title, because of a couple things. One, she had a run-in. Well, sort of one of her answers was that she believes marriage was between a man and a woman. And that pissed off a lot of people. And she thinks that she lost for that. Maybe she did. I don't really know. To be honest, like that seems like the kind of answer that you don't
Okay, but can I also just say this? I mean, I don't...
Yeah.
This is not beauty pageants and those kind of things are not my field of expertise, right?
Okay.
But isn't the whole point of like the question and answer section to sort of be like, oh, let's see like the beautiful side of like their spirit and like their values and stuff. Right. So if you have extremely piggish values and you lose, I don't know.
Sorry, exactly.
Sorry,
right.
Man, that sucks. Yeah, you screwed up the question section.
If they answered like I'm Antifa and I actually think you should punch fascists, like they would have no problem. Too. Yeah, exactly. With them being losing for that. So now, so she had some other stuff going on. Trump kind of came to her defense, which was interesting in this whole thing. Kind of, I say, because he's like, that's Barack Obama's position, which is true. That like a lot of cowardly politicians held that position. But then some like, ultimately there's a messy lawsuit where she sued like Miss California USA, and then Miss California USA sued her for repayment of a loan for $5,000 for breast implants. Whoa. Which is just like, I kind of look at how these pageants work is, I don't know, a bit weird to me. But anyway, she's doing something new now and which is anti-mask, I guess, appearances at school board meetings. Here's this.
Here we go. You see my shirt, it says mama, and I'm a mama bear, and I know there's a lot of mama bears here tonight, and no one's going to mess with our cubs. That's right. So you know. I'm a resident of Encinitas, born and raised San Diegan, and tonight I'm simply here to tell you to unmask our children. We're done begging. In fact, we're done asking for permission.
That's right.
We are going to be unmasking our children today.
That's right.
The pandemic is over. The parents are done. We're done asking you, public servants, for permission. We are done.
That's good enough for that. So yeah, the pandemic's of course not over. There's it is maybe peaking this new wave. Now, who's to say whether we're not going to have another one in the dead of winter like we did last time? But for instance, it's peaking in San Diego, or I don't know if maybe that's optimistic for San Diego. It's high in San Diego right now, so very much not over, and more deaths are going to follow. But also that your public servants. Again, this is vax sort of, and I don't want to call her an anti-vax. I don't know what her vaccinated status is, but sort of attitudinally, these people aren't pro-vaccine, and they are hell-bent on not having their kid masked in schools. Now, the truth about masks, there's a new study, I already linked to it in the comments. The real conversation should be the government should supply every student surgical masks. Like that should just, and then we can basically have school with very, very little risk, because surgical masks are extremely, extremely good at controlling the virus. Now, cloth masks are a marginal upgrade, still something, but what we talk about that, we're talking about the bare minimum that teachers ask for their safety. And you got to be able to just live with it, right? Like this isn't even about the vaccine. This is what, put the mask on so your teacher doesn't die. And these people want their, snotty little kids to be coughing at like 60-year-old teachers. And it's awful. It really pisses me off that they frame it, because this is the new Tea Party. There's Koch brother money, if not cultivating this, following it, and this is their strategy for the midterms, and it's revolting to me that this gets conveyed as some sort of populism when really this is the worst kind of like sort of wealthy entitlement as far as I'm concerned.
No doubt about it. I mean, like the politics behind it is that it's easy when you're the opposition to sort of be against the pandemic, right? Which is why they're playing that move, and that's why there's money behind it. But yeah, the soul of it is 100% entitlement, and like let's not forget the kind of people that are teachers. I mean, this is a profession, an occupation that is overwhelmingly working class, and has very high numbers of people of color, and working in its ranks. And yeah, it's the kind of callousness that the mama bear has to all of the other people who provide a public service to their children and to all children. Yeah, it's such a horrible and anti-people
and it enables
version of politics.
Yeah, and it really enables like the sort of I fucking love science resistance dem to say like, look at how much better we're doing, right? Like when really we should be talking about these more advanced measures that we can really save people and allow school to continue to take place. And like the fact is like schools are just way underfunded, and like we should be able to filter air. We should have open windows. Like this stuff should be like a competent government should be able to do this shit. Let alone like the most, wealthy government in the fucking planet.
Exactly. No, I mean, keep y'all's eye on this, because this is going to probably develop into a whole other, new direction for them. I mean, the funny thing is that, as much as you say like, oh, the Trumpist wing of this, Trump is completely cucked by this movement. I don't know. I'm sure you've seen the videos of him getting booed for saying,
Look, I like
take the vaccine,
freedom.
take the vaccine. It's really good. And all the people start booing him, and he completely backs down. So this is another moment where it's like, you've created something that they can't even control. And the thing is, the Republican donors and the people who want to just use this to sow social discord, as we were talking about earlier with the abortion law, they don't really mind which direction it goes, because the funny thing is that, at the top, they're all taking the vaccine. They're all, for the most part, whatever, you could dunk on some of them for not wearing masks at a time like that, but like, they're doing the things generally to protect themselves, and they know that they have the full protection and access to healthcare that a lot of other people don't.
Fox News has vax requirements.
Yeah. No, it's like, it's such a joke. The leadership is completely separate from these kind of outrages, but they'll write any level of social discord as possible.
Because they need that. Like, that GOP will take it where they can get it, as far as like sort of movements go. And like, even if it does threaten, the economy again, by like, you can't say no to like that sort of anger, because I think you don't want to, just like the Tea Party, I think you want to be suspicious for money influence, but this is a genuine sort of, there's some life to this sort of sentiment. You can tell, and it's not. And I do play the Kari Prigine one because it is funny to like a football player's wife who like was sort of disgraced Miss USA. Like, I think like she's probably going to run for office at some point. Like that to me.
That's exactly. This is real for your like audition tape for politics.
Yes, exactly. Like there's this great Nixon tape, to bring up Nixon for the second week in a row, where they're responding to John Kerry doing anti-Vietnam sort of testimony, and Nixon's like, he's going to run for office, and he was absolutely right. And this is
it's actually really
yeah.
I mean, Nixon would know, an opportunist.
Absolutely. I mean, at least like Kerry was doing something for good. Like, this is for like, as we said, to force teachers to get sick for their kid to just not wear a mask. Just wear a mask. I mean, that it should be a lesson for kids that like, hey, we can do something communally to protect people, and they're threatened by that. Should we tease post game and then get to our interview a little bit?
Yeah, I think you should. Matt's got a big announcement. Matt's been stewing on something for a little while. He's got a big apology he's going to make in the post game.
Oh, yeah, I do. I'm going to apologize to myself for deleting a couple tweets, one accidentally and one on purpose about a year ago. I'm going to get into the time that the canceled Brett Weinstein tried to cancel myself, and he didn't try to cancel me. He tried to just get me fired. So don't get too upset.
Don't get those confused.
Exactly. Yeah. But we'll be talking about that in the post game. I'll be revisiting that in light of him killing members of his audience in part because of spreading anti-vax attitudes. And when their family is looking for photos for their funeral, they come across a whole bunch of posts like red pilled on the vaccine, and then like, oh, I wish my dad had taken the vaccine, but now he's dead. Well, we're going to talk about what that guy has to say to me about broadcasting in dangerous environments. So that's in the post game this year. I'm looking forward to it.
No, definitely join us at the post game at patreon.com/leftreckoning. Also later this week, we will be doing a think tank. So if you are a patron, I'll be putting up a post after the show for you to be able to put in some questions for us.
Our plan on the think tanks is first of the month Patreon. So if people want to kind of towards the end of the month start thinking about what your questions are, and we'll get into it then.
Yeah, and they don't have to be long form questions. Like even just asking for general thoughts or a topic is also really fun too. But yeah, looking forward to that. Well, before we go into this, let me introduce this just slightly and also remind people on the other side of the interview that we're about to play, Matt and I are going to be doing a primer on the Battle of Blair Mountain. We wanted to have a guest on for this week, but we weren't able to swing it, but we will have one on for next week to talk about it. Really looking forward to that conversation. But yeah, we'll be doing a quick primer, just informing people as to what the event was in some kind of historical context. So that'll be on the other side of this interview. And coming up right now, my conversation with Stella Rooney, who is going to help us break down what's happened in the UK recently. As people in the US know, the left is in very much of a crossroads in this country, and in the United Kingdom, it is as well. When some people make demands that we need to return to labor and return to these movements, sometimes people have a little bit of a hard time grasping, well, what do we really mean by that? What's like the meat on the bones of that, the concept? In the United Kingdom, Unite, which is the second largest union, just had an incredibly historic election for their general secretary position, where a much more radical, much more labor focused, in the sense of like going back to the shop floor focused politics, won out instead of just attaching itself to the Labor Party. It's a really insightful interview. Stella is absolutely fantastic, and I hope you all enjoy it.
All right, here we go, folks. We will see you on the other side.
Welcome back, everybody, to Left Reckoning. David Griscom here. Post Bernie Sanders and post Corbyn, the return to labor, having a renewed focus on building working class power, has become a real desire, something that a lot of people on the left have been talking about wanting to do. Well, in the United Kingdom, there may be an opening. In the recent Unite the Union election for General Secretary, Sharon Graham, who ran on a renewed promise to prioritize workplace organizing and expanding workers' power and benefits, won the election. What does this shift mean? I'm joined today by artist and trade unionist, member of Unite for 5 years, who is involved in this campaign as well, Stella Rooney, to talk about this. How are you doing today?
I'm good, thank you. Thanks for having me.
No, I really appreciate you taking the time today. This is a really important election. I think it's a really exciting moment that is going to have a lot of lessons for both our friends in the United Kingdom and also us here in the United States. But just so we're all on the same page, could you sort of explain to our American audience what is Unite and maybe who were the candidates in this election?
Yeah, sure. So Unite the Union is, I think, technically the second largest, but one of the largest trade unions in the United Kingdom, and it's also in Ireland as well, all of Ireland. And Unite is the kind of inheritor of different iterations of unions, such as the Transport and General Workers Union, the TNG, which is a very famous union in the UK. Also, other unions have joined together in construction and in other sectors. But Unite, primarily, a lot of its membership is in the private sector. So we're talking aerospace, construction, manufacturing, finance as well. But it also does have public sector membership in areas such as local government or in the health service as well. So it's a really big union. It has over 1 million members, and it's also a very politically important union as well. Unite was one of the biggest supporters of Jeremy Corbyn, who in winning his leadership of the Labour Party. I think it would have been very difficult for that to happen if Unite hadn't supported and funded a lot of his campaigns. And in terms of this leadership election, it was very significant. The previous General Secretary, Len McCluskey, is a very kind of famous figure in kind of left-wing politics in the UK, because he has kind of always been unashamedly on the left, no matter what way the wind was blowing, which was not a popular position to take before Jeremy Corbyn came to leadership in 2015. So in the run-up to this election, it has been building for a really long time, so it's quite nice to have it actually culminated, bit of a relief. But they were... At one point, there was 4 main candidates, and in the final stage, there was 3. So I'll kind of give you a brief timeline in the run-up to the election, just for some context.
But just before you get to that, could you explain sort of what the position is to people?
Of course.
It's not like a symbolic thing, right? This is a position that has a lot of functional power within the union, correct? Yeah,
so the position of General Secretary is not just a kind of tokenistic position. Unite, like many other unions in the UK, I'm not so sure about the US, but the General Secretary has a lot of sway. They effectively sign off on many things that happen in the union. And although there is an executive council that make most of the decisions, and there's membership conferences. There is lay member democracy, of course, but ultimately the overall direction of the union is really determined, not only, but it has a massive influence, and they have a lot of power to either be proactive about moving things forward or to perhaps drag their heels a bit. So that's why it is really significant.
Yeah, and then so we've seen the results here, but yeah, as you were going to do a kind of quick timeline of who the candidates are and what they were representing. Great,
yeah. So the candidate that won is Sharon Graham, who I'm very happy to won. I campaigned for her from the beginning, and I'll get into the reasons about why this is significant. But she basically stood on a left-wing platform, but was also about kind of changing the union, deliberately saying that things in the union are not necessarily working the way that they should, kind of on a reformist platform. There was another left-wing, there were two potential left-wing candidates. Only one made it on the final ballot. So the candidate that made it onto the ballot from the left, the other one, Steve Turner, was supported by a lot of the kind of internal leadership in Unite. Len McCluskey, for example, previous General Secretary, supported him. And he was seen to be, a left-wing candidate, undoubtedly left-wing, would call himself a socialist, but much more of the institutions of the union. And to say that Sharon Graham does lead the organising department in Unite, so she's not a lay member, rank and file candidate, but the difference was that she was supported by a lot of the rank and file, a lot of representatives on the ground, whereas that Steve Turner, I think it is fair to say, was supported much more by the kind of left-wing bureaucracy of the union. But I would start off by saying, he is a very decent man. He's not, he's a socialist, he is a trade unionist. He is not someone who would have ultimately continued the union the way that it was going effectively. He was kind of a continuity candidate. And the other candidate that ended up getting onto the ballot was a much more right-wing candidate, Gerard Coyne. And Gerard Coyne ran previously in the last leadership election and actually nearly beat Len McCluskey, which would have been a disastrous result. And he stood on a platform of effectively really taking away the industrial muscle of Unite. A lot of discussion about kind of insulting the leadership because they were so invested in supporting politicians like Jeremy Corbyn and intervening on policy. But really, he was backed by, the Murdoch press in the UK, for example. He was given a lot of donations from quite wealthy people. Really, it would have been quite disastrous for workers if he had won, because he would have really restricted the work that Unite is able to do. And he also wrote in newspapers like The Sun in the UK, which many trade unionists don't support because of many reasons, but specifically Hillsborough, which is a big thing in itself. But so that he basically represents the right wing of the trade union movement. So he stood as well in the final ballot. And the final result was Sharon Graham won by about 5,000 votes. Steve Turner came second, and Gerard Coyne came last, which was very pleasing to see.
I'm sure, yeah. I mean, it shows that there's a strong constituency within the union itself. And I mean, this is such an interesting election within the union too, because I mean, from my understanding from the outside, there really was a push in the Graham campaign, to kind of like revitalize the actual, shop floor aspect of union work, instead of just sort of focusing so much on, attaching itself to like the Labor Party and the political movements out there. Not that it's not a political movement, but that it's not so tied necessarily to, the political party as such. I mean, she put out a pretty extensive manifesto. Are there any highlights that you would want to, note for folks?
Yeah, definitely. So some of the key message of Sharon Graham's campaign was, her slogan was, get back to the workplace. And that kind of informed a lot of what she was putting forward. It was a very industrial focused manifesto. It was very practical as well. You know, there's a lot of suggestions in there that really could be put in quite easily. And I think if someone was to read it, it's online if anybody's interested as well. It's still up, but it's 8,000 words. But actually, a lot of it is very practical. It's not big idol. It is about ideology, about the ideology that workers, should have more power in society, and that we need to fight for that. And these are kind of the tools that could help us do that. But it's not making grand, sweeping, vague political statements, as maybe some of the other candidates might have done. It's not claiming to do things that a union can't do. I think, as Sharon Graham put it, it was about doing what it says in the trade union tin. And it's not to say that unions shouldn't be involved in politics. They should campaign on the issues that members want to put forward, whether that's higher wages or better housing, or all these different issues that affect workers are important. But if the party we'd like to be in Parliament, to be in charge of the Parliament isn't the government, we can lobby all we want, we can write to our MPs, but if we don't have the majority, workers have to use their labour and withdraw their labour to force that change to happen. So some of the key things in her manifesto were about restoring kind of lay member democracy, around also improving education for workplace representatives, also really a lot about how we can bring these industrial issues and kind of take on the big employers in the sector. And one particular employer that Sharon Graham has highlighted that she is going to go after is Amazon, which is really exciting. But a lot of it as well was about going sector by sector. Unite has members in lots of different industries that are cross UK, but also global, in a globalized economy, because it is a private sector union. So, for example, companies like British Airways, also there's many other examples, car manufacturing, oil rigs, all these different kind of. So a lot of the manifesto was about getting all the reps from these different sectors to drive the bargaining agendas in these sectors, which would mean that, you could get all the reps from aerospace together in a big kind of democratic decision-making body, and use that to target I think she talked about the top 10 employers in each sector, and to force those employers to bring the bar up on pay and conditions. So they would effectively use the power that they already have as well to not just, fight against job losses and job and pay cuts, but to drive the bar up, which is something that unions have sometimes declined from doing. Sometimes it's just about kind of putting out fires rather than going, what, we should make things better. And really it was about getting back to the workplace, in the sense that focusing heavily on the industrial, on the workplace issues, and using that to build real power in the shop floor, in the workplace, and also in the community, and use that more as, I think there's a real implication that creates more political power for working class people.
Yeah, and I mean, to borrow a little phrase from Leo Panich, it's one of those differences between like class focus and class rooted power. And I just want to read a small section. And again, people should definitely check out the manifesto. And as Stella was saying, like there's a lot of stuff, especially at the beginning of the manifesto, that's like very practical, very like nuts and bolts, boom, 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 we're going to do this. But for people who are sort of interested in politics and, political theory and strategy, I found this paragraph to be very illuminating. She says, this is in the section on workers' politics, where she says, for me, if we are to fight the worst successes of modern capitalism, if we are to sustain a consensus and create a new political center ground, then we can only do this through the painstaking work of building our forces within the population at large. We simply must be more than policy proposals and demands. We have to help deliver practical support in the communities which we claim to represent. We have to find our place in people's daily lives, whether that be as a strong industrial union or within the community. We have tried our political project within labor. It has failed. A whole host of fronts have been set up. None has delivered power. We have waited for the spontaneous struggle to emerge. It hasn't. We must now actively build from the ground up. There are no shortcuts. And for me, I found that to be, a very powerful statement, especially with a lot of the shifts that we're also seeing in the United States too, where we're trying to figure out, how do we build left socialist power in the U.S. We don't have a party or anything like historically that represents that. And a lot of people here have a hard time thinking about politics as doing anything other than just like going to the ballot box, right? And I keep on saying, it's like, well, we have to build our power because, at the end of the day, this is all sort of class struggle. And, building up our power and organization is really important for us to be able to get our demands met. And the problem right now is that we have politicians who, I think genuinely want to fight for working class people. But as I was saying earlier, it's like a class focused politics, right? Where you can say, we want this to happen versus class rooted politics. And I found that to be really illuminating. On that, I would ask, as this campaign was going, how were people reacting? You said earlier that she already had a lot of support from rank and file members, but when you were talking to folks in the course of the campaign, what was being hit? What was really resonating with people, you think?
Yeah, and I think that's a key point, because I think it was this kind of work that really secured the vote, secured the result. I think many people, Unite is an interesting example because in the most recent election in the UK in 2019, we found out that I think about 40% of Unite members voted Conservative. And that was a really disastrous election result for the left, for many reasons that we don't really have time to get into. But I think one key thing that happened was that Unite were making these political arguments. Those reps and activists were involved, understood the political arguments, but it wasn't getting through to the majority of members because, the union wasn't organised enough and we weren't making those political arguments in a workplace. I think one thing that really captured the imagination of people, from my experience, was talking about a kind of positive vision for how our union could look and a realism about the situation we are in politically. As mentioned there, Unite was one of the real proponents of trying to get a left-wing leader as leader of the Labour Party, and that resulted in Jeremy Corbyn, which was, something important. And it would have been, it's not to say we shouldn't do that. We should encourage trade unionists who are able to stand for election and to get elected. That's something we should do. But we didn't do the other part, which was also to say that, this is one form of political power, but it's not the only form. It's only kind of one half of it. And if you don't build this power in workplaces and communities, then how are we going to take our demands and force a Tory government or, a hostile multinational employer that doesn't care how clever we are or how good our arguments are, they're going to look at how much is this going to cost us? Why would we want to give into this if it's going to cost us money or it's going to go against our ideologies? I think people were really excited about the prospect of building a really strong and fighting union. More in the power that Unite had a lot of power and a lot of it is a really significant force in kind of UK industrial relations. In certain sectors, they really are able to drive the agenda of what terms and conditions and jobs should be. But I think there really has been a kind of loss of that ambition about, and I really kind of, it's that thing about, as Jane McAlevey said, raising expectations. I think the fact that she ran on a platform of actively raising people's expectations of what a union should do, what it could do, and also being very practical about that, and saying, I'm not a politician, I'm not going to deliver, this election, but I will deliver increase power and dignity for working class people, which in the situation we're in now in the UK, where Labour are nowhere near power in any part of the UK, except for Wales, but only by a thread, it's a realistic vision, but it's also an inspiring one. And I think, as she says there, it deals with the nature of capitalism that we live under today. And just on the actual nuts and bolts of the campaign, people, activists were going to workplaces at 5 a.m. before they started and leafleting and then going back for when people finished. Wow. And in a big industrial union like Unite, where there's lots of people who work in still really big kind of workplaces who are physically going in. And, it was, I think a lot of this really was won by hundreds and hundreds of activists across the UK doing that painstaking work. And I also think I think she was very clever and tactical about thinking about what are the networks of people that are already going to vote for me? What can I do to get those people to speak to other people who might not vote for me? And, she does lead organising in the union. So I think that definitely helps, that expertise.
That's certainly an advantage. And well, in a minute, we'll get to some of the stuff about the broader left. But before we move there, you've said on Twitter, I believe, that the United election was as much about an organizing versus servicing model of trade unionism as it was about left versus right. You sort of touched on it a little bit, but could you elaborate on that a little bit more for us?
Yeah, definitely. So I think the media coverage of this election in the UK was quite terrible, to be honest. It really related everything in terms of the Labour Party and politics, and which candidate, Keir Starmer, who's the leader of the Labour Party now, who's more right-wing than Jeremy Corbyn, which candidate he would have preferred, which really wasn't at all relevant to anything that was going on with this election in real life. It really was a battle of ideas about what the union could be. And this is why I think that ultimately, as I've said, I think there's Steve Turner, who was the other left-wing candidate, is a decent man. Like he's principled, and I'm not meaning this to insult him, but I think the reason his campaign fell short is because it didn't actually. It was about a kind of a pitch more for political leadership. He talked a lot about green jobs, for example, and talked about creating green jobs, but didn't really say, for example, how those jobs are going to be created and how a trade union leader could create hundreds of thousands of jobs. That kind of sounds more like a pitch to be elected to Parliament, in my opinion. So it was like kind of the difference between just standing on this kind of left-wing policy or standing on a real industrial vision and understanding what it is to lead a trade union and how a trade union works. And I think that this is a real divide that I don't know a load about US trade unionism, but I have followed quite a lot, different stuff that's been going on. And I think there is a real kind of divide emerging between those who, some even on the left, who don't want to break with this kind of idea of a union is there to deliver for its existing members, and a union is just kind of there to service them and to keep them happy. But ultimately, in the world we live in, when mass employers may be, cutting jobs, those kind of more industrialized jobs might be in decline. If you do that, you're going to be facing decline as a movement. So I think what Sharon Graham offered was much more of a plan to organise the future and to actively grow the union, to really expand in size, and kind of the way that you could do that on lots of different levels. I think many people on the left, who I respect, I really profoundly disagreed with on this election, because I think they tried to make it out again to be a policy discussion, a discussion about who kind of deserved this job, as if because Steve was seen as some sort of incumbent. And also, I should mention, something that really drove this discussion and made it slightly nasty on the left was the fact that Gerard Coyne's right-wing leadership posed a real threat, and that would have been a disaster if he had won. But I think it was really important that, the people involved in Sharon Graham's campaign did not forget, you know, the potential that this could really have if she won, because we were really told, like, to shut up effectively. We were told that we were splitting the vote and that it was going to end in disaster and it would all be our fault. And we, you know, we were right. We said, no, this is about the future of the union. This is about plans for building a strong union that can actively take on the Tories, take on hostile employers, that can it is kind of fit to take on, you know, the environment of modern capitalism which we live in, and realistic about that. So I think that comes down to that battle between an organising model, which is about it building power in communities, building majorities, saying that, you know, why, and having a plan to do that, and a servicing model, which is about, you know, we're going to deal with the members we already have, we're going to service them. And then by service, I mean, you know, people will put in, I don't know what you call it in the US, but we call it a grievance, for example, where someone will write to their employer and be like, I'm unhappy with my pay, or, you know, or I think there's sexual discrimination happening, or, you know, whatever it is. But someone will put, like, and then that just gets dealt with, and it's kind of like a union kind of acting for someone rather than, you know, and it often serves those workers which already have kind of acceptable terms and conditions. And it's not to say they shouldn't exercise their right, but, you know, it really doesn't serve for the majority of workers who are facing things like 0-hour contracts or low pay or fire and rehire, where, you know, companies are firing people and make them sign worse contracts to keep their jobs and stuff. It doesn't deal with those real issues which go to the heart of why we need unions.
Yeah, and it also, I feel like there's an expansive posture versus like a defensive posture.
Definitely.
Too, and you know, I just wanted to note too, like this is one of these lessons too when it comes to, you know, to green jobs and greening the economy. I highly suggest people listening to this, if you haven't already, listened to the interview I've done with Ryan Pollock here in Texas. But, you know, having serious conversations about how to make that shift with union members and with workers is critical. And I think a lot of people on the left sort of miss that, you know, for a lot of folks, they hear stuff like that and it either seems pie in the sky, or if you're here in Texas where a lot of people's jobs and livelihood are dependent on oil, right? You know, they see what they, you know, and honestly, if you've lived in the United States, you know, in the past few decades, anytime there's a change, it's a bad change, right? So, you know, obviously some people get nervous, and this is why you need to be bringing working people to the table instead of, you know, on these questions of green, right? Like, you know, so like one of the things here is the concept of a just transition, right? It's like, if you work in these industries, not only are we going to make sure that your livelihood is taken care of, right? And promise you 5 years of pay or whatever, but that, like, these unions will actually be leading the transition. But anyways, that's just something, you know, to note, because I think that that's one of those big divides that some people on the left have with a lot of union members. But on this kind of divide question, I do think that this also highlights something in the UK. And, you know, I don't want to speak out of turn here, but right, like you were saying that there was all these claims that this was going to split the vote, right? But for most of the people who I talk to, a lot of my friends in the UK who are very involved in their communities and in their unions, they thought that was ridiculous from the get-go, right? Despite the fact that a lot of people in the media were saying the opposite, right? And it sort of, it reveals a little bit, in my opinion, I won't speak for you, but a little bit of a lack of connection that some on the UK left have with the base. And I know that there was a lot of nastiness that was sort of thrown around, especially towards the end. We don't have to relitigate that, but, you know, this election really did, you know, from an outsider perspective, seem to show a kind of divide in the UK left. Do you think there's any lessons that we can draw from that, other than just pointing and flexing our muscles and saying we were right, you were wrong?
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's ultimately about one of the ways that the institutional left fails to build these coalitions around a left candidate. For example, the process in Unite, you know, the left-wing organisation called United Left, which is effectively the kind of like left faction in Unite, which supported Len McCluskey's leadership, for example. And they decided that they were just gonna, I was a member, not a member anymore because of support Sharon, but they decided they were gonna have a hustings, and it was between two candidates. One was Steve Turner, but Sharon would never have been able to go for that, even though she was potentially the person that had the potential to beat the right-wing candidate, because she had a lot of buy-in from grassroots reps, activists, and also she appealed to a section of the union that might have voted for the more right-wing candidate, because which is an interesting thing. So we don't really think about who's best placed to actually win. We kind of, it's like, it was effectively, and I should say at this faction, the left-wing faction, which I was a member of, and I'm not necessarily insulting the people involved, but there was 1,000 people who voted in that hustings out of a union of 1 million members. And there is no way that you can say that, there's only 1,000 socialists in Unite. Like, that would be insane. The people in activist reps in their workplaces are the people kind of carrying out what socialism is all about in their daily lives when they're representing and standing up for their fellow workers. And so many people didn't, many of these people who kind of voted in these kind of hustings were very institutionalized. They were the people who sit on these committees and are either, actual themselves employed by the union as well. And yeah, I think that this really comes, I think what we have to learn about this is, sorry, did I cut out?
Oh, no. I was just wanting to ask, briefly. Are there any like geographic divides there as well? Are people sort of concentrated in major cities, or would you say that Unite the Left is sort of spread out?
Yeah, so it's interesting here as well, because there's different dynamics in the different areas, which I could talk for hours away. But potentially, what a big significant thing as well was that Sharon got a lot of support in Ireland, for example, because, and she did get a significant amount of support in Scotland as well, because she stood on a platform of allowing devolved political decision makings to be devolved to countries and also regions in England. And why that's significant in Scotland is because there would have been no way for the union to ever take a pro-independence position, and because it's kind of a top-down decision that is made, and that won't necessarily happen. But it means that it kind of opens the door to that possibility, which is quite exciting. And just one other thing I wanted to kind of touch on as well is, like, I think this is there's a lot of lessons in this for how we build, I think, misogyny on the left as well, because I really think that like many unions and like general society, it's not something worse than unions, whatever, but misogynistic and sexist opinions and biases are there. And I think because Sharon was seen as this kind of outsider character, she wasn't seen as left enough by those in this kind of like left-wing faction, but she kind of in many ways delivered on left-wing policies in the way that they maybe didn't. I think a lot of this does come down to gender, and kind of all respect to Steve Turner, but I think there was an element of kind of feeling like this was his turn, like rather than he was the most qualified person to lead the union. And I guess I'm just so pleased that perhaps people will now reflect on who we pick as our leaders, and why we pick them. And it's not to say that someone is a bad person or anything if you don't think they're the person to lead or to speak at this, or to to kind of to be the face of something, or to speak at a rally, or to take a leadership position. But sometimes you do have to think about who is the most to offer, who knows how to do this the best, and it's not always the person that might have been someone's right-hand man the whole way through. This is how these this is how nothing ever changes.
Yeah, no, I mean, and it should just be noted for people who aren't familiar, Sharon Graham was the first woman to lead the union too.
It was very exciting.
Yeah, no, it's a beautiful development, and I mean, I know that I think it's important everybody to celebrate our victories, but we all have to remember that it's a long fight ahead, and be watching this very closely. Stella, I really appreciate you taking the time to hang out with us this afternoon.
Great. Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Yeah, it really is an exciting development, and thinking about the future of the next 5 years of what I think it is an opportunity for Unite to really set the bar of what is expected of unions, and not just at a high media level, but what happens on the ground. And I think this is an opportunity for the whole trade union movement to kind of, because Unite is such a big force, to really kind of raise the bar and empower the great organising which is happening and doing more of it everywhere.
Yeah, no, words you can live by.
All right, folks, we are back. Also, I just want to say the internet's holding up very well now, but weather is going crazy in New York right now. There's a tornado warning in the Bronx. Yeah, which, I mean, I hope that doesn't turn out to be anything, because tornadoes are scary enough when I'm in North Dakota, but like this many people, like, and you hear people talking about clouds swirling over Central Park, and really, like, not a great day. I think you know what I think it is? I think God's mad at the Republicans in Texas.
And he's smart because he's attacking New York City. I
mean, look, it's he's not the most precise, We've all read.
He's just omnipotent.
Yeah, exactly. Omnipotence does not mean precise, so necessarily. But yeah, so hopefully the internet holds out. Hopefully no one gets hurt.
Yeah, absolutely.
But one more point I wanted to make that I forgot in the discussion before, that all this anti-mask stuff comes in the context of this abortion stuff. We talk about like just coercion, right? And it comes in the context of the unemployment, expanded unemployment getting slashed, and already having been slashed in certain states. It comes in the context of what was the other things? I don't know. Oh, the eviction moratorium being decided again by the Supreme Court that this isn't something we're going to do. So, like, the things that are really being coercive in the society being overshadowed by, ex-Miss California and some freak that's running for office in Pennsylvania.
By suggestions in most cases.
Yeah.
Right.
So, but anyway, let's move on to the history segment, which is a little bit more interesting. I have this quote that I always like from Orwell, and since it's kind of a transition from our UK conversation here. If people think that Orwell is, I'd be curious about a critique for this thing, but it's always stuck with me. It's from The Lion and the Unicorn, and it's a section here. For long past, there had been in England an entirely functionist class living on money that was invested, they hardly knew where. The idle rich, the people whose photographs you can look at in the Tatler and the Bystander, always supposing that you want to. The existence of these people was by any standard unjustifiable. They were simply parasites, less useful to a society than his fleas are to a dog. By 1920s, there were many people who were aware of all this. By 1930, millions were aware of all of it. But the British ruling class could not admit to themselves that their usefulness was at an end. Had they done that, they would have had to abdicate, for it was not possible for them to turn themselves into mere bandits, like the American millionaires, consciously clinging to unjust privileges and beating down opposition by bribery and tear gas bombs. Now, like this story of Blair Mountain, and again, like I don't know if that's an accurate categorization of the timidity and docility of the British ruling class. Certainly, probably not in the colonies. But it's always interested me that awareness that America we're just gonna fucking do this stuff. So hopefully next week we'll have Charles Bikini, the author of The Road to Blair Mountain, Saving a Mine Wars Battlefield from King Coal, did a really great interview with our buddies at the Valley Labor Report that more people should check out on the Battle of Blair Mountain. And really an insane, and David's going to give a longer spiel, but certain things that stuck out to me is the context of, the first context of sort of being let down by Wilson. The Democrats finally get the presidency back, basically because of a working class split of the Republican Party, Teddy Roosevelt and the GOP proper, which was disdainful of any sort of like populism. Hands the White House to the Democrats, and then Wilson, doesn't deliver for them. Surprise. And also, just the context of the war economy, the coal and the expansion, and like what happens after that that demand is gone. That's a difficult issue, and just the way. And also, I think more interesting from a military standpoint is we're all familiar with Guernica, the Spanish battlefield where the Nazis supplied air power to bomb people, civilians. Air power involved here, not to necessarily bomb people, is my understanding, but to surveil the battlefield, which is, just to say America innovating. So I want to turn it over to David now because he's got more.
Well, also, I mean, they threw tear gas from planes as well. So that fits very well with what Orwell was saying. I'm really looking forward to this in-depth conversation next week, but we want to make sure that since we are sitting on the 100-year anniversary, that we took a moment to sort of honor this panel, this really incredible moment in American history. And I figured the best way to do that, since next week will be more in depth, was to just sort of paint the picture for people who might not be familiar with the events, right? In light of all of the recent attacks on telling history in this country, I really think it was important to make sure that we know that we have this radical history of resistance in the United States. And these fights in our schools are meant to flatten American history. Unfortunately, there's people on the left who try to do the exact same thing and ignore all of these incredible moments of heroism, of working class people trying to fight for a different world. You can't sanitize the struggle out of it. And we're not going to let these right wingers destroy these stories. So the Battle of Blair Mountain is about a 5-day battle in 1921. 10,000 coal miners took on 3,000 lawmen and others who were brought in to stop unionization efforts. You got to understand the conditions of this time. We're talking company towns, company-owned lodging, company stores, and of course, the mines are all owned by the bosses. People might be familiar with the term people being paid in scrips. Which are essentially vouchers that could be used to buy things in the company store, right? Which is how you were paid. Instead of paid in US dollars, you were paid in, these vouchers, company currency, essentially, to buy your food, your furniture, etc. from, again, the company-owned stores. Now, in some cases, not all, in some cases, you could transfer those vouchers to US dollars, but at a very, very, very heavy loss to yourself, right? So something like 75 cents to the dollar, if I remember correctly. So you're seeing this happening, and this is why this story is so, reminiscent of today, because you see corporations try to come up with similar schemes today as some kind of new innovation. It's like, no, this is what happens when you have bosses who aren't feeling any pushback, right? They think that they can just barrel over any kind of opposition. Because this is those kind of things are inherently anti-worker, right? No doubt about it, right? So in West Virginia, you see the rise of these, what are called yellow dog contracts, which were forbidding workers from joining a union at all, along with just general brutal conditions in the workplace, and private detective armies were fighting and preventing people from joining unions. Remember, I can't remember the statistics off the top of my head, but, Matt was just alluding to, this is in the period of World War I. It was safer statistically to go and fight for the United States in war in World War I than it was to be a coal miner in West Virginia. And just so people know too, there were peoples who had been in that part of the country for a very, very long time. But there were a lot of, Black folk who had moved up there recently, and a lot of immigrants who were brought into that community, right? So there's a lot of different groups at play here. But just to get to the story of Blair Mountain, people were being held prisoner in Logan and Mingo counties, where unions had been extremely suppressed. And a pro-union sheriff, Sid Hatfield, was assassinated when he arrived at McDowell County Courthouse to face charges himself of murder, right? And Sid Hatfield had become very much a hero folks in this pro-union movement in West Virginia. So him being assassinated really sparked, an eruption of of resistance among folks.
My understanding is that Hatfield was the Hatfield from the Hatfield and McCoys, and it struck, which is my understanding from this book by Robert Shogan. But if that's true or not, I think it is. It strikes me that like we know the story of the Hatfield and McCoys is like this sort of like parody of like the South and like drunken gunfights. And meanwhile, Blair Mountain is just written out.
No, I mean there's a lot of things that are written out of Blair Mountain, and I have to say again, as a Texan, like this is not my history, but it's something I can draw a lot of inspiration from. So this guy, this pro-union sheriff, which is an interesting conception in the first place, right? Basically public servants, right? People hit him alongside with the mayor of his town were very much pro-union versus these company towns that were, adamantly against him, that they essentially, you got to understand, the bosses own the police force. They essentially own the government. They own the house that you were living in. Like there was no sense of democracy or public, right? It was private that you were essentially leasing.
Yeah. If you get in the union, you lose your house.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. You get fired, you're out of there, which was why it was such a threatening period for folks. But basically, after he's assassinated, union members flocked together with the intention of marching on Mingo County to challenge the coal companies and free unionists who had been held in prison. And I just want to note a couple things about the makeup. I mentioned earlier how a lot of different groups of people were, in this part of the country, doing these kind of coal jobs. You have to remember that this is a really incredible moment in American history too, where you have Black, white, and immigrant mine workers taking up arms to battle the coal companies that were, exploiting them and ruining their lives. And people should also remember that the bosses knew how to try to use, racial animosity to their advantage. And they would oftentimes try to bring in Black labor, for example, to break strikes, or to serve as scabs, right? With the intention that people are going to see there's difference between these groups of people and it stokes hatred. And then people never realize that it's the fucking bosses who are the problem. Anyways, on this march to free the people who were imprisoned after this assassination, they marched through Logan County, where anti-union and boss forces, along with state police and deputies, gathered a 3,000 person force, right? The pro-union forces were around 10,000 people. And they came up against a fortified mountain, Blair Mountain. The anti-union forces had dug in trenches, and obviously with that money and power, they were able to secure machine guns and fortified those in that location. Think about this for a second, right? Labor dispute, right? Fermenting into a kind of public action, being met with military weapons, military tactics. It should also be known, I don't know if you're familiar with this, Matt, about the story about the origin of the term redneck.
I heard that in the Shogun book, but it slipped my mind because I was, listening to it.
These are one of those things. I'm no historian, so I don't want to sit and say with all authority on these things. But there's a story about Blair Mountain that the workers there, as they go into this battle, they tied around red bandanas around their necks so that they could be able to see who was on what side of the battle. And some people say that that's where the term redneck came from. I like that history a lot better than most of the other ones I could imagine. So
yeah, we'll ask Dr. Keeney, but I think that is true. I mean, and also we should just take that as a moment to talk about like the anti-communism and the Red Scare element of this too, which is like just accusing the union workers as, oh, you guys love Lenin and Trotsky or whatever, right? Like those accusations. That's the vernacular. This was
the Russian influence.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And, the union men fought bravely, though they had, more numbers than the opposing forces, the defending forces. They were completely outgunned. In fact, the private forces had got a bunch of planes to fly overhead, and they were, as Matt was saying, doing surveillance, but also dropping tear gas and small bombs on people.
I didn't hear that part. That's nuts.
Yeah, so it was an air bombing in the United States of America, right?
In 1921.
In 1921. Along with this, basically, eventually Harding sends in President Harding orders for the U.S. Army to come in and suppress the miners. So the U.S. Army sends around 3,000 people, along with the United States Air Force, I believe, as well, to provide more air support. I do not know if they did bombings or not, but more air support, and basically overwhelmed the Union and the mining forces. And the miners, most of them escaped, but about 1,000 of them were charged with treason and murder. And though most of them got away with it, or got away legally, this led to long legal fights. But this was a really critical moment in American, labor history. It hurt the UMWA a lot in their membership. But around 10 years later, that became one of the more powerful and well-organized unions in the country. And even before that, the immediate aftermath of this battle did lead to improved conditions for working people, because there was a kind of realization that these are a group of folks who aren't just going to take these kind of things sitting down. So this is a really incredible moment in American history. It was the largest insurrection since the Civil War. Over 1 million rounds were fired in the battle. And there's an active fight right now to try to suppress this history. So know that this is, our history as Americans and our tradition as well, is standing up against all odds for one another. And I'm really looking forward to next week when we can get a more in-depth kind of telling of the story. But I want to make sure that people knew about it, because 100 years, man, it's sort of crazy to think about.
Yeah.
As far away as it sounds, how close that is to us today still.
Exactly. And just, yet another reminder of how our political economy is enforced with force. Really. It wasn't just, we all just want to participate in markets and get along. That's why we all came to these agreements. No. Folks, do you have anything you want to say on this? We're going to go to the post game now. I'm excited to do this Weinstein stuff. How Brett Weinstein tried to, not cancel me, sorry, just tried to fire me, which is, that's just a normal thing to do. But and then he went and got his fans killed, or at least one fan. So that will be, for the post game, will be probably about 15-20 minutes. And thank you all so much. Patreon.com/Left Reckoning to get that. And we will see you next week.